Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Divine Vintage by Sandra L. Young, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, May 2013. Tess Burton swept a handful of frothy fabric up to the mid-morning light that streamed through the shop's bay window. The flapper gown was perfect, with no moth holes or stains. Cradling the dress in both hands, she walked toward her new assistant. I let my heart rule and pushed my price limit when I bought this yesterday. Attending auctions and estate sales was a perk of her new adventure. On this sunny Tuesday in early May, they were prepping to offer Divine Vintage's finds to Michigan City, Indiana. Tessa's smile faded in recalling the responsibilities attached to a new business. A decades-old building, a very part-time employee, and a bank loan. Her fingers tightened on the dress. She'd taken a massive risk in opening the shop. If Divine Vintage failed, she'd lose her dream career along with her inheritance. She could end up a bag lady at 28, wandering the streets with a knockoff knapsack. She tried to shove back the insecurities as she reached the glass case that served as a central display and checkout counter. Don't panic. Focus on the positives. You sure can't beat shopping in the name of business, she said, though she'd have to avoid future splurges. One hand on a stack of beaded sweaters, Marcy Alexander paused. She straightened to a height of 6 feet, her slim yet curvy frame topped by a mass of curling auburn hair. Imagine a 1920s debutante floating down a staircase in such a showstopper. That dress is worth every cent. I totally agree. I can't resist a garment when its history speaks to me. Without a warning, Tess found herself submerged into a vision of the beaded aqua gown swishing around the calves of the first proud owner. An elusive tune played in her ears, followed by a burst of laughter. Her breathing sped up as if she were dancing a foxtrot with a dashing partner. As she and the man twirled toward the center of the dance floor, an exotic fragrance wafted from the fabric of the dress. Tess clutched the dress to her chest and spun in a wide circle. The sounds and scent faded. She stopped and blinked, and the world came back into focus. Yes, she really was standing in the middle of her new shop. 10 minutes before their initial opening. Marcy clapped her hands, jangling the stacked bracelets on her wrists. You're the belle of the ball. She grinned and resumed folding a sweater. To calm the lingering sense of dizziness, Tess dipped her head and hid her relief. Marcy's artistic leanings left her unbothered by her boss's sometimes quirky behavior. Others might label her a nutjob. She'd never shared how her imagination soared when she handled the most appealing vintage items. Trying on a wedding gown that dripped with lace, she'd experienced the radiant confidence of a 1950s bride. Steaming a chiffon prom dress called up a nervous, perspiring teen with a beehive hairdo. These were never fleeting images, but deeper, heart-tugging responses. She experienced an unexplainable empathy where, for a few pulsing seconds, she almost became these women. Yet this latest incident had been more vivid, more real. Probably intensified by her nerves, Tess thought. The foxtrot music flitted through her ears as she hung the dress so that it faced the entry door, as if to immediately draw the customer's attention. Satisfied with the arrangement, she stepped back to take one last critical view of the shop from a newcomer's angle. Over weeks of cleaning, stocking, and decorating, she and Marcy had transformed the former candy store into a cozy boutique. She'd painted the walls herself, rolling on pale lavender with sage green accents. White wicker shelving units and hanging racks featured clothing grouped by type and era. Everything from aprons to earrings was for sale, including dozens of dresses, evening gowns, daywear, cocktail shifts, and mod minis. Her brow wrinkled as she returned to the counter for her cup of low-fat cappuccino. I should have brought champagne today. I was so caught up in going over details in my poor frazzled brain. I hardly slept last night. We'll share a more formal toast at the grand opening in a few weeks, Marcy soothed in a zen voice. For now, here's to a hot new business and a super hot team. Team is the key word, Tess said, knowing she couldn't have handled all the demands without Marcy at her side. The shop looks fantastic due to your flair. I'm very thankful. She took a quick sip of coffee, hid the drink behind the counter, and rechecked her watch. She'd survived the anxiety-producing flurry of planning and hard work. The opening hour finally had arrived. She flattened her palm over her nervous stomach and glided to the door in her full-skirted 50s dress. After one deep breath, she turned the deadbolt, slipped the sign to open, and savored the moment. My shop, my sweat, my tears. Even a drop of blood when I jabbed my thumb tacking on that loose button. She grabbed a scarf and waved it in the air. I now proclaim the opening of Divine Vintage. "Woo!" Marcy hooted support. She draped the scarf on a mannequin and headed back toward the counter, a bit let down at the lack of true fanfare. I hope the press releases and social media posts will coax a few people in today, though Tuesdays probably won't. The door swung open with a merry chime from the attached bell. An elderly woman entered with a man young enough to be her adult grandson. All rational thought evaporated into a fog between her ears. The guy was downright gorgeous. Her former boyfriend, emphasis on former, was fine-looking, but this one notched it up a full step. Heat flushed her cheeks as she met dark brown eyes, plush as 1930s velvet, under thick honey-toned hair that lay obedient against his head except for a cowlick near the right temple. He caught and held her stare. Embarrassed, she dragged her eyes to his female companion. Tess gauged her as late 70s with coiffed white hair and a tailored suit. Though she was barely 5 feet herself, the woman who approached the counter at a spry clip was half a head shorter. Her much taller companion followed. "Welcome, you're our very first visitors," Tess managed a cheery greeting. "How can we help you at Divine Vintage?" The woman laid a stack of flyers on the counter. "I'm Esther DeLeon, and I congratulate you on your lovely shop. I live in Carver House, and I thought your clientele would be especially interested in our upcoming special event." She spoke in a cultured tone, reminding Tess of ladies who lunch. "We're holding an anniversary tea and style show on Sunday to celebrate the centennial of the home. The proceeds will benefit one of our favorite causes, the local homeless shelter." She glanced up at the man beside her. "Trey is my cousin's son. He insisted on driving me to deliver flyers after I sprained my wrist. I attempted to wrench out a stray tree that rooted in my prize hydrangeas." She lifted her other arm, revealing a bulky bandage. "You know you should have called me to pull out the sapling." The voice matched his look, warm and sugar-coated. "I'll run past your place before or after work any time you need help." He patted her uninjured hand. Gorgeous, paired with kind, thoughtful, and respectful of his elders. Now there's a keeper. Tess warned herself to remain professional, but the heat returned to her face as he stretched the hand toward her. "Trey Dunmore, Boy Scout extraordinaire, at your service." She joined in the laughter. "I didn't realize I'd moved to Green Gables. She extended her hand and stumbled, realizing she'd forgotten Marcy's presence. Tess Burton. And her mind blinked again as his hand enveloped hers. A whisper of indefinable sound echoed in her head. A spark, bordering on painful, shot up her arm and spread across her shoulders, raising the hairs on her neck. Her eyes widened as his narrowed. She pulled her tingling fingers back and attempted to capture her thoughts. Introductions, open mouth. "Speak." She concentrated to form simple words. "This is my assistant, Marcy Alexander. We're happy to share your flyers." "Good to meet you both." Seconds ticked before Trey Dunmore's searching expression cleared, and he stretched his palm toward Marcy. As they shared polite hellos, Tess breathed deep to calm her heart rate. She'd never experienced such a strong reaction with a person, or a piece of clothing, yet she couldn't dwell on the interaction. She couldn't afford to appear scattered and unprofessional. First impressions counted, especially in a new town. The house was a safe topic. "Carver House. I enjoy seeing the grand old place when I walk past on one of my routes to the shop." She'd identified it by the historical marker on the wrought iron fencing. The rosy brick home dominated a corner lot with mature trees and lush flowering gardens. Though she kept a good pace on her walks, her steps always slowed as she daydreamed about living in such a mansion. With the homeowner before her, she could only stammer. "The architecture is amazing, with the wraparound porch and the turret. I can only imagine the lively history within the walls." Marcy nodded. "I grew up here, and that's my favorite house in town. Those stained glass windows are to die for." Esther DeLeon's brows drew together. She focused on the stack of flyers and aligned the edges with manicured fingernails. "Unfortunately, the early history was clouded by a sad tragedy, but we've risen above that." She raised her eyes, and her voice strengthened. "I couldn't let the century anniversary pass unnoticed. The mansion has been a private home within my family, and people always want to peek inside. I decided to celebrate and welcome visitors while also supporting charity." "A sad tragedy. Had an accident occurred during construction?" Before Tess could ask, Trey jumped in. "Esther restored the beauty inside and out. You might recognize the style as Queen Anne. Our ancestors apparently preferred Victorian romanticism," he grinned. "Sorry for the clinical tangent, a hazard of the trade." "You're an architect." He craned his neck to examine the original tin ceiling tiles. "At a firm in New Buffalo, you've done a fine job repurposing this great old building." Her gaze followed, delighted at the affirmation. She'd been adamant about salvaging the feature. With any old building, you have to stay on top of the upkeep, he added. Hopefully you had a good inspector if you bought rather than renting. Hidden problems can cost a boatload of money. Her pleasure withered. Did another know-it-all jerk lurk behind his attractive exterior? I did my research as always. She tried not to glare. The owner didn't want to rent it anymore, so yes, I own the building. The inspector was highly recommended, and of course I'll keep up the maintenance. He shrugged. Just saying. Her teeth gnashed, barely missing her tongue. She'd had her fill of defending her actions and plans with her ex. The silence grew awkward as Esther leaned closer to stare at her over rimless trifocals. Tess squirmed under the probing gaze, smoothed a hand over her hair. Was the older woman upset that she'd stood up for herself? Forgive me for staring, dear. Esther's expression lightened. Would you consider modeling for our style show? You'd be a perfect fit for the trousseau gown. I hadn't thought to include it due to the small size, but what a treat to add a special dress dating back to the centennial. Sometimes being small is an advantage, except when it comes to high shelves. Tess was glad to move past the minor friction with Trey. That sounds like a perfect afternoon to me. Will all the models be wearing vintage clothing? Yes, the garments are from former inhabitants of Carver House. Our ancestors stored some of their pretty dresses in the attic. The oldest are quite tiny. Her voice rose with enthusiasm. Thankfully, the century-old wedding tuxedo fits Trey like it was made for him. His mouth turned down, but the look was tinged with humor. Esther caught me at a weak moment. The older woman didn't even spare him a glance as she patted his arm. Your family, dear. Conversely, Marcy watched him with animated interest. Tess imagined her assistant swallowing a contented sigh. Then she mentally kicked herself to straighten up and behave. The guy was attractive, despite his comments about her building, but the encounter had tilted her precarious balance on this all-important day. Esther drew her attention again. I do hope you're free to join us on Sunday. Tess smiled at her with true anticipation. I'm always up for a vintage adventure. I'd be honored. She picked up a flyer to scan the details. Should I stop in sooner to ensure the fit? I'm certain the dress will work. She appeared almost girlish in her glee. Come by around noon. I'll orient you and provide a quick tour. Wonderful, I can't wait. The delightful lady evoked memories of her beloved grandmother. And what a treat it would be to see the inside of her home. No doubt the previous inhabitants had owned some impressive garments. Maybe one day the family would sell the pieces. Tess would appreciate a chance to purchase them. While Esther beamed, Trey's expression remained cryptic. His gaze lingered on Tess, and another flush of heat traveled through her body, spreading slowly, unnervingly downward. She held his eyes for another loaded moment, experiencing a flash of déjà vu. Another time, another place. She pushed aside the strange fleeting thought and the reminder of their earlier charged handshake. The hum in her body had to result from potent opening day emotions. Plus, she'd attempted to boost her energy earlier with pastry and caffeine. After this distressing encounter, she might have to give in to a second eclair. But first, she had to fulfill her role as a gracious business owner. She'd faltered a little with her snippy tone about the building. Thank you for visiting today, Mrs. DeLeon. I'll see you this weekend. Both of you. Please call me Esther. The lady halted to grasp her hand. You are doing me a great favor, but now we need to distribute more flyers. Trey is such the workaholic, I must make the most of the time he's taking from his busy schedule. He rolled his eyes and mocked a servant-like stance as he held the door. Esther lifted an eyebrow at him and addressed Tess. I promise to visit again when I have time to browse. She stepped outside, her poof of hair shining in the sunlight. Trey flashed another sexy grin. You've made her day. Thank you, ladies. Tess smiled back though her lips quivered. He headed out the door, and she watched them walk down the sidewalk. She wondered how he'd act toward her on Sunday. He'd likely be surrounded by pining women, and they'd barely speak. Probably for the best. Her previous failed relationship had damaged her confidence and soured her on romance. She glanced up at Marcy. How about you handle it out here for a while, and I'll check for web orders? Wasn't that a fun way to kick off our opening day? Fun? As she snorted out a laugh, the diamond stud in her nose sparkled light. Trey Dunmore's the yummiest eye candy I've seen in a long time. To my utter dismay, he only had eyes for you. You noticed I wasn't thrilled with his comments about the building. What you saw as interest was pure politeness. A man who'd escorted an injured older lady to a vintage shop must have been a Boy Scout for real. Tess turned, intent on retreating to her tiny office. You make him sound boring, but your reaction seemed pretty intense in the moment. What do you mean? She rolled to see Marcy's teasing smirk and smiled back. Very funny. Yes, he's a tad intriguing, but my real interest was sparked by Carver House's sad tragedy. Esther's comment was vague and mysterious. I think there's talk of a murder in the house's history. Marcy's eyes danced with excitement. Ooh, maybe you'll see a ghost. Despite her assistant's hopeful expression, she chose her words with caution. No need to tempt the universe. Personally, I'd rather not run into any ghosts. Although my grandmother told me spirits are always here with us, she was kind of attuned that way. Are you saying she was psychic? Though she recognized a potential kindred spirit from habit, she wiggled around a direct answer. Not that I know of, but she was comfortable with the concept of communicating with the deceased. My parents were straight and narrow farm folks and weren't happy with Graham sharing those far-out ideas. She hesitated. I thought we'd have more time to sneak in some discussions. She was gone way too soon. She sounds really special. As Tess gazed at the window display, her eyes filled with tears. How she wished her grandmother could have been here to share this special day. Graham was an incredible, creative person, and she gave me the greatest gift ever. I could ditch my stressful bank marketing career to embrace our love of vintage clothing. I uprooted and remade my life thanks to her. I know she'd approve of this gamble. The shop also provided a lifeline to regain a positive outlook after the draining relationship with Brett, but she wouldn't grant him any headspace today. Anyway, I'm excited about modeling a beautiful dress and spreading the news about Divine Vintage. What a burden that hunky cousin Trey will be modeling too. Marcy's curls bounced as she angled her hand downward for an enthusiastic high five. Tess reached to meet her palm and mirrored her wide smile. They pulled apart as the bell tinkled to admit the mail carrier. Happy opening day! Looks like you gals are having a much better time than I am, he said with a wink and a flourish of envelopes.